for which I have two important tools, which is 2 minutes and stop for the speakers. Aloysia, when he put the panel together, asked, as the title reflects, asked us to address a few of the trade and issues, particularly as they relate to the economic relations between the United States and Brazil, and impacting Brazil in particular. And the ones listed, environment, energy, and labor, really do reflect some of the most difficult and most timely issues. And we're very, very blessed to have 4 experts on the panel to introduce these topics and ideas, and hopefully to provoke you for questions and comments at the end. I'll introduce them a little bit. You have the bios, but it's worth at least noting the experience that they bring. And so in order, we'll start with Nicole Bivens-Collinson from Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. Nicole brings to this wealth of experience, both in practice and in her previous roles as a negotiator and trade policy expert at USTR and at the Commerce Department. Next, Nicole will give us sort of an overview of the spectrum of issues that the United States and Brazil are confronting, followed by Brad Feigl. Brad is and has been since 1995 the Global Director of Government Relations and Public Affairs for Nike. And clearly, given Nike's role in the world, he spends a lot of time on corporate social responsibility, public policy, regulatory, administrative, and legislative matters. I had the great good fortune to work with Brad over the years, as well as in his previous position when he served as Chief International Trade Counsel for the Senate Finance Committee and was responsible for myriad legislative issues going through the committee at the time. And Brad will give you the perspective of a company facing these issues, both in driving policy as well as trying to find meaningful ways of confronting the challenges. Next, we'll hear from John Magnus. John is of counsel at Miller & Chevalier and president of Tradewinds. John as well comes to these issues with a great deal of experience on international trade matters, having been a master in private practice for many years in a number of important trade issues, both in trade regulation as well as in the WTO. And John will give us, I think, the sort of more immediate and short-term perspective on what the new administration and Congress are likely to do. And then finally, we'll hear from Jeff Schott. Jeff is at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, where he has been for many years, having come also from a distinguished career in government. And Jeff is extremely prolific in his writing and research, and will then, I think, finish off with a more long-term perspective on these problems and how the United States might confront them, and I think more generally how Brazil and other countries are going to confront them. So with that, let me turn it over first to Nicole.
Great. Thank you very much, Andy. I put together a few slides just to guide and let you see what I'm going to be talking about. Can you guys see okay? Are heads in the way? I think we'll be okay.
Poor posture.
I think on the earlier panel you heard about the linkage and the direct linkage of finance and trade, and I think something that we have not talked about are some of these other linkages. They're not what I consider traditional trade issues, but are having a greater and greater impact on the relationship between countries and among countries, and those are the energy, the environment, and labor. And those things are being molded, and we're going to, as Andy said, we're going to go through them in a progression by the Congress, the executive, our new administration, and the public. And part of this that's molding this, as you know, is we had a change in our Congress. We had a switch to a larger majority of the Democrats, and the Democratic Party has traditionally been those who have promoted a lot of the tenets of favoring a linkage of labor and trade. They have also taken on a linkage of labor and the environment, seeing that those two go hand in hand. And now with respect to energy, it's sort of become energy, environment, labor, all one word, so that they are all three going to impact the different areas. The other is looking at the president and the administration. We do have a new administration, and as many of you may have seen in the news over the past 8 years, there have been some proponents of, in the environmental issues, the energy issues, who believe that there was a regression in some of our forward-thinking policies that had been set previously. And so the question becomes, will the new administration, or how will the new administration undertake some of these? And I think it's really interesting. I mean, President Obama has made statements, everyone has seen, that he clearly is a proponent of free trade. He says, I am a proponent of free trade. But he also has mentioned many times that they have to have strong environmental provisions and strong labor provisions in the trade agreements, and that the United States needs to be better bargainers. So that's going to definitely impact our trading partners, and particularly Brazil, some of the larger ones. The other, of course, is, I think, the economy, which is going to have an impact on what's going to happen. I think we're seeing some of that already. And a little bit of that we saw sort of in the Buy America issue, and I think some of my colleagues will talk about that a little bit later. And public opinion. There's been, there's a question as to whether or not there is a public mandate for reversing our trade policy. And there's some polls that have been done looking at this and say that there's been a growth, at least in proponents or sitting members of Congress who say that they are proponents of fair trade. And the question becomes, what is fair trade versus free trade? Let's take a look at the energy and the environment. As I said, these two have sort of become linked. There are several members of Congress who are very supportive of stricter legislation that's putting mandates on different industry sectors as to what they can do or how they can process their goods inside or outside the country. And I think that's going to have a very big impact. Of course, we've all heard about the climate change and the cap and trade, what's going on. That's part of the energy issue, which also is part of the environmental issue. Again, this all becomes one big, long word. The efforts to reduce America's dependence on foreign oil. I mean, how is that going to impact Brazil? It could impact Brazil in a big way because of the ethanol production. Is there a possibility of removing the 54-cent per gallon tax on the ethanol? Is there going to be an increase in standards or requirements for the percentage of ethanol that needs to be included in any type of gas or that's marketed to our cars? So this could have a very big impact on trade, I think, between the United States and Brazil. The other is we have the green ports legislation, which is trying to look at our different ports. There have been some studies at some of the larger U.S. ports, for example, Long Beach, Los Angeles, and up in Seattle, and a few of our other big ports, looking at what impact on the environment is being caused by these large ships that are sitting there idling. The ships may be idling because there's so much incoming cargo that they can't be processed quickly. How is that impacting the fish, the wildlife, the whales? How is that impacting the noise in the neighboring communities? How is that impacting the emissions that's coming out of those? So all of these things, these factors, may be governed by some of the states. And I think the states are another area that we have to watch what type of regulations and laws they put in place that are actually going to impact trade internationally. For example, you've got the state of California for the Los Angeles Long Beach port, and they have put on some new taxes with respect to cargo and containers to try to address some of these green ports issues. Who is that going to impact ultimately? It could impact the consumer, or that those additional costs and fees could go back to the actual manufacturers, and that money is taken out of the pockets of our suppliers, which could be China or Brazil or any other country. And then, of course, we've talked a little bit about, we know that the Nafta potential renegotiation or updating, or however you want to take a look at it. I wanted to give one example of where I see something as maybe just the tip of the iceberg, looking at what I consider, again, non-traditional trade issue in the environment, which has directly and hugely impacted trade in all aspects. And that's the Lacey Act. This was a provision that was put into the Farm Bill. And there's always been a provision which has prohibited the sale or trade of endangered species. And they made an amendment in there to include plants or products thereof. Well, if you go through and look at our tariff schedule, which is about this deep and has 99 chapters in it, it was going to impact 85 out of the 99 chapters of products, because everything is made from a plant derivative. the pharmaceuticals that you take. The filler is made from algae or other kinds of plants. The man-made fiber that you use, a lot of the rayons are cellulosic-based, which means they're plant-based. The pencils that you use, the paper that we write on, all of these products are going to be impacted by this requirement that you have to submit a piece of paper which had to disclose the origin, the species, the genus, the value, the volume. I mean, how do you get the linear volume of a tree out of a pencil? I'm not sure. When you made your entry into the United States, the problem was the U.S. Customs was not prepared to accept this additional information. So there was no automated way to receive it, which meant you would have to submit a piece of paper to help protect endangered plant species. It just wasn't going to work. So the other problem is, as soon as you submit a piece of paper, you're going to stop traffic immediately because you are no longer able to submit something electronically. So we were seeing a huge percentage of the trade being impacted, a complete almost shutdown in the trade if you have to submit a piece of paper. And we were going to see all of these goods stopped at the border. Well, we've kind of been put on hold. Right now you can voluntarily submit this information on a piece of paper when you make entry if you want to, but starting April 1st, you're going to have to do it electronically and it's going to be required. It's also been defined and narrowed to only certain chapters. With respect to Brazil, they're phasing this in 6-month increments, and if you look at the first 3 6-month phases of this provision or this requirement, the trade between the United States and Brazil, if you look over the last year, was at $1.9 billion. So it is going to impact a lot of the trade between the two countries, and that's just one. And Brazil isn't our largest supplier of these woods. So this just gives you an idea of how these types of measures impact directly trade. Let's look at the labor. Can the labor standards get tougher? I mean, it's always possible. You can make them as tough as you want or as easy as you want, and there's a real belief that under the current administration and the current makeup of the Congress that this might happen. We have to consider the role of the labor unions in pushing some of these standards forward. And we have to consider the reaction of some of our trading partners, because there may be some point at which countries who are looking to enter into potentially a deeper relationship with the United States start looking at the costs of what they have to do, what measures they have to put in place, what laws, what restrictions, what enforcement, and they may say, you know what, it's just not cost-benefit analysis, it's not worth it. I'm just going to trade with the EU. So it's something that we gotta think about. The other thing we need to look at is what's going to happen going forward. There's a recent bill that also was passed, and it's the TVPRA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. Again, it's another small piece of legislation that was inserted into a very, very large bill. And what this does is require the Department of Labor to produce a list of products that are made with forced child labor. And those products are banned from entering into the United States. Now, that list was due January of this year. It's been postponed until January of next year. How does that impact Brazil? Right now, there is...
In Brazil, I might add, it's 35%, which is, again, another subject. I think I've got 4 or 5 Brazil mentions in here, so I'm doing pretty well.
Very well.
But it just seems to me that, you know, and those of you who follow the U.S. Miscellaneous tariff bill structures and other type of legislation, these things get bogged down in Congress for years because Congress can't move on them because of these arcane pay-go rules and all that. So, you know, these tariffs that exist, sometimes very high tariffs, remain in place because Congress is unable to eliminate them, even though there's no domestic opposition. So everyone agrees that these tariffs are no longer needed. Let's get rid of them. Consumers are paying, you know, in many cases, a lot for these tariffs, but there's really no mechanism outside the normal legislative structure to get these things eliminated. Now, you know, again, legislation takes a long time, but these things sit around for a long, long time. So if we can eliminate these tariffs, companies will benefit. You could argue that the benefits would be reapplied into enforcement. And so how do you do this? Well, I think you basically take, you know, these non-controversial tariff reductions out of the regular congressional process and run it through a system, through an administrative process, and Congress gives the president proclamation authority to proclaim them. So if there's a process where you can demonstrate there's no opposition, there's no domestic industry being hurt, then let's find a way to move this through outside of Congress and to get it done. Recognize it's a little kooky, but I think there's ways you can do it consistent with the U.S. Constitution and potentially even within the WTO rights. Now, you can even take it a step further, a little bit out there even further, in saying those tariff reductions that should only be applied for companies who are willing to certify and go through audits that they're doing programs on the ground to protect the environment and protect workers. Again, a little self-serving because I think we've got a pretty good program. But if you want to get other companies to get on this program and do it, you create those kind of incentives, they'll be after it. And lastly, I'll conclude with we got to be more creative with using our tax code. We use the R&D tax credit for a variety of things, for wind and all that kind of thing. Let's find ways to reward companies who invest the time and energy into getting after these programs on the ground to improve labor and environment. So just in conclusion, I think it's really important if we're going to make any improvement on this. I think we've got to stop this old stale debate about labor linkages with trade and other environmental issues and get out of this sanction-based approach. Now, I know there's some significant headwinds. Democrats are in control. They love this kind of sanction approach. But again, I think if we work together to convince them that incentives will create the same way, I think you're going to make significant progress. And you take this and get WTO approval, it actually may unfreeze the Doha round.
Brad, thank you very much. It's great to talk about policy, but it's very, very useful to hear how it impacts a company and the kind of role that companies are playing and how companies see the role that we all can play. Let's move now to John and to talk again about sort of the immediate to near-term challenges and developments.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm John Magnus from Miller & Chevalier, and I have to start by saying that my remarks are just mine, don't reflect law firm views or client views, and that it's a big honor to be on a panel like this morning. I'm grateful to have been included. I will fall short of Brad's standard in a couple of ways, including the number of mentions of Brazil. I think I might be able to get to 2. I have one for sure. As a starting point, there's a little essay that I did about, 2 months ago on key questions related to the next chapter of U.S. trade policy, and it was posted at the website of this obscure newsletter called Inside U.S. Trade, which actually does accept and post opinion pieces. I was previously unaware of that. And in preparing for today's discussion, it seemed like the 6 questions there might be a good place to start. The first one is paradigm. What is going to be the overall strategic paradigm that the U.S. government will follow that will make sense of all of the various strands of our trade policy to replace the competitive liberalization paradigm that the last government used and that was heavily criticized in the context of the last election contest. So presumably is going to be rethought and perhaps replaced, but not at all clear what will qualify to supplant it. Second question is, what's the emphasis going to be, relatively speaking, between reforming existing arrangements and concluding new ones? Third question is about votes. Will the new government allow any major trade liberalizing items to come to a vote? The fourth one is on one of today's topics, blue and green, labor and environment. Will the United States now pursue a blue and green agenda in the multilateral part of its trade diplomacy, which it hasn't really done before? Fifth one's about enforcement. Where's all the rhetoric about enforcement going to take us now that the primary authors of that rhetoric are fully in power? And then lastly, sort of the wild card issues. What's going to explode on the agenda that with sudden speed or unblock itself in a way that nobody expected? So anyway, I was too cowardly in writing that piece to venture any answers, just sort of raising those as things, questions that are going to be important in terms of the next chapter of our trade policy. So I've resolved to be a little bit bolder today and to indulge in some speculation in 2 of these areas. One is sort of the general trajectory of the blue and green part of our trade agenda. blue and green for labor and environment. And then the particular problem of PPM-based trade measures, PPM standing for process and production methods. So first on blue and green. The May 10th principles, which you may have heard of, were announced in May of 2007 to great fanfare. You had a newly empowered Democratic leadership in the Congress and the Bush administration, and it gave labor and environmental issues a new, more exalted place in the U.S. trade policy template, and blue and green conditions, which had for a long time been part of our preference regimes in the United States, would now be in bilateral and regional trade agreements. Some people thought that this was revolutionary. Some people thought that it was cautious and incremental. I think from today's vantage point, one of the most important things to know about it is that it was described at the time by the participants on the congressional side as the best compromise that they could achieve with a sitting Republican president. Got as much as they could. Now, I'm told that they have now been freed of that constraint. So it is reasonable to wonder about each of the limits in the May 10th package, including, for example, what substantive obligations are we going to enshrine in trade agreements, which ILO conventions? To what does this new set of obligations apply? Does it get stitched into existing trade agreements that are already in force, or only new ones? And most importantly, what about the WTO? Because there was no mention at all of taking the blue and green agenda into the multilateral sphere. There are now indications that the U.S. government and the Obama administration will seek to take the blue and green agenda both backward and forward, if you will. Backward in the sense of trying to stitch into the NAFTA, the May 10th principles, and bring the NAFTA up to, or maybe beyond, the May 10th standards. And then forward into the multilateral sphere. And my evidence for that is a comment by none other than Howard Dean, speaking recently in Davos, who showed great confidence on the point. I'll quote here from another obscure publication called Washington Trade Daily. Former Democratic Party Chairman Howard Dean said on Saturday that the United States cannot visualize a Doha trade agreement without a strong component on labor and environmental standards. He made it clear that Washington will insist that a global trade must ensure proper coverage of labor and environmental standards. Now, Mr. Dean does not speak for the Obama administration, but I believe he speaks knowledgeably about the Obama administration. So there is some early indication, early in the new world here, that perhaps our government will try to run this set of issues up the flagpole in Geneva. You might wonder, I think Jeff's going to speak about this, how the world will respond, especially in light of the fact that a Doha deal has been pretty elusive even without new U.S. demands in these areas. Mr. Dean's trial balloon got some support from the WTO's host country of Switzerland. Swiss Trade Minister Doris Leuthard arguing that labor and social standards should have been in the Doha package and certainly should be part of the next multilateral round. And then some opposition from elsewhere. Mari Pangestu from Indonesia, who said developing companies will never agree to labor and the environment as Doha issues, said that the Seattle ministerial collapsed because of those issues, that they can only be dealt with by the other organizations that exist for that purpose. And Brazil's Foreign Minister, Amorim, who expressed concern and said Brazil has already taken, this is quoting again from Washington Trade Daily, already taken sufficient measures on the environment and needs no lessons at all on the importance of labor rights for workers. So my bold prediction is that President Obama will indeed, before very long, go past the previous high watermark established by President Clinton when he mused to a reporter around the time of the Seattle ministerial about a social chapter in the WTO rulebook. So fasten your seatbelts. On PPMs, and this is a point more specific to the environment and energy threads of today's discussion. And I guess I would put the question this way: in a world where carbon control schemes and other sustainability measures are increasingly finding it necessary to focus on how products are made, how might we see the trading system's current hard line against PPM-based trade distinctions be softened. And again, PPM stands for process production method. The old example of PPM-based regulations, the old examples are familiar. They tend to involve border measures and endangered animals like dolphins and sea turtles. The new ones are more challenging. They involve things like transportation fuels and regulatory measures that allocate market opportunities or market advantages according to PPM criteria. It turns out, for example, that there is a good reason on environmental grounds to wonder about the feedstock used at biofuel factories. But trade rules, based on the cases litigated so far, are inhospitable. Measures like these raise a lot of questions about the standard itself and a given product's conformity, and whether that's determined privately or by government, and what legal consequences and other consequences attached to meeting the standard, failing to meet the standard. I think the broader point is that the desire to reduce the transportation sector's contribution to carbon emissions is going to give rise to national measures. They'll be very popular, and they will test the now fairly rigid rule against using PPM criteria to determine the treatment of products. At the moment, in order to justify a PPM-based measure, you have to do some fairly impressive things. You have to essentially show that the measure was the only real option that you had, that using a PPM-type measure was the only real option that you had, and that the particular one you chose was the least trade restrictive one available, which is difficult. But the rule with respect to PPMs exists for a reason, and to move away from it is rightly seen, I think, as opening Pandora's box. Some of the panelists today, and Andy especially, I know, has done some thinking about what might be inside that box. Not all PPMs are equal. Some of them are implemented product by product, and others use shortcuts where you say, well, does this come from a good or bad country, this good that showed up at my port? Where there's really sort of a PPM criterion behind it, but you've made judgments on a country-by-country basis about whether the production methods are acceptable or not. Some PPM measures are border measures that directly control importability, and others are less directly trade-related. They may control access, for example, to consumption subsidies. My bold prediction here is that WTO panels are more likely to begin to find some flexibility if they are presented with the right cases. And specifically, I think they might have an easier time warming up to the idea of a PPM if its effect were to determine access to a consumption subsidy rather than being determinative of importability altogether. Now, whether that sort of case will make its way into the system and when, and who the parties will be, and how everybody will line up, I have no bold predictions on that point. So I'll close there. Look forward to the Q&A.
John, thank you very much. You really did touch on some of the hot button issues, and including the connecting well back to Symposium 4, where we talked about exactly some of those PPMs, and so it's very helpful to put it into this new context given the new political construct. Last but clearly not least, Jeff Schott.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Aloysio, for inviting me back to this very stimulating forum that you hold every year. I know there are a lot of smart people in the audience who have things to say on these subjects and have some comments or questions asked, so I will try to keep my comments fairly brief so that we can have time for a discussion. Like Brad, I know I'm old enough to know that these are not new issues. They've been around for a long time, but what makes them different is they're much more salient today than they were back at the dawn of the GATT era. If you look just at labor was knocked off the trade agenda at both the beginning and the end of the GATT era. So it's been persistent, but it has been unsuccessful to date, though I think some of the comments on the panel this morning indicate that there are going to be renewed efforts. Certainly, the trade and labor agenda was a flashpoint in the ratification of the Nafta back more than 15 years ago. And it was a key and very contentious part of U.S. negotiations with the Central American countries and with Peru and Colombia in particular. And it is now again, as was mentioned in President Obama's meetings in Canada yesterday, part of the renewed NAFTA agenda in terms of interest in upgrading the 15-year-old agreement to better reflect some of the things that we have learned in the subsequent period as a result of changes in the world economy, as well as lessons that negotiators have learned in negotiating subsequent trade agreements that have much more extensive provisions on labor and the environment. Trade negotiators learn by doing. They often learn very slowly, but they make progress over time. And I think there's a lot that has occurred in the past 15 years that can be applied to improve the NAFTA relationship. And I think that's the spirit in which President Obama broached the subject with Prime Minister Harper yesterday. Now, energy and environment. There have been a lot of comments on the panel so far on this, and I think the previous speakers have raised a number of very good points. There are a couple of questions. How do we fuel economic growth in coming decades without doing irreparable harm to the environment? That is a dilemma. Rex Tillerson, the chairman of CEO of Exxon, was on this platform just a few weeks ago. He came down very strongly on the side of meeting the needs of energy security. But there are other groups who say, how do we share the burden of reducing the global volume of greenhouse gas emissions without distorting trade and investment? And this is where there's a big challenge for the United States and for Brazil. And it's not just a question of ethanol tariffs. And not just a question of concerns about deforestation. It also involves the prospective development of offshore oil resources and the role of increased use of fossil fuels in a planet which is going to have to find some ways to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases going forward. And it's not just something that the United States and Europe is going to have to do. It's going to have to be done by all of the major emitters around the world, and that includes China, and it also includes Brazil. Where it poses a specific problem for the trading system is because pricing carbon and committing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions will affect what we produce, how we produce it, and where we produce it. This goes even further than the PPM saga in a sense, because at its core, it involves charging for a previously free good, carbon. And this which ultimately will result in some sort of reallocation of wealth, both within countries and between countries. And that's why politicians don't like it unless they think they're going to be on the receiving end as opposed to the giving end. That is a key part of the international dilemma, and what will complicate or will be a challenge for U.S.-Brazilian relations going forward. This is not talking about ethanol. This is only a small part of this story. Now, when carbon taxes and or regulatory mandates raise the cost of production of goods or of their energy components, the affected firms will come under competitive stress. So what will they do? They have a number of options. They can either improve productivity, which many firms are already trying to do. They can relocate, which is not an option for some companies. They can halt production, which is an option that many companies are being forced to consider. And or they can lobby for protection, which seems to be the option of choice for many, via subsidy, whether it's free carbon permits in Europe or ethanol subsidies or the like, and import restrictions. Those are the options for firms. And they're deploying a variety of these. What do the countries do or governments do? And here we have action by both national and subnational governments. So states and provinces in North America are very actively engaged in this business. Well, the governments, countries, will jealously protect their commercial interests, even while extolling their environmental virtues. But when push comes to shove, particularly at a time of economic stress like we have today, national legislation will be driven by competitive concerns. And that is a real threat that environmentalists are quite concerned about, because the big push, the Al Gore wave, is being swamped now by the concern of the most dramatic economic recession since the 30s. And these problems have already surfaced, with threats of trade protection echoing in Brussels and in congressional debates. They also come out at the state houses and in California, in Alberta, in Manitoba, where there's a carbon tax on electricity production. It's coming up in a variety of areas. Now, what can trade officials do? Well, they are unprepared. They can't do very much right now, and in part because WTO disciplines on the tools used to combat global warming are vague, whether it be the implicit rules on subsidies. How do you determine if there's an implicit subsidy if carbon is mispriced? And what is the effective price of carbon? The trade rules are subject to ambiguous exceptions, as was previously mentioned. The litigation so far on some of the cases presented in the WTO, trying to interpret or examine the scope of the exceptions to MFN treatment under Article 20 of the GATT. Those have only touched the surface of the problems raised by these broader environmental issues. And I don't believe the legal precedents offer a good ground for governmental action. They offer a great scope for litigation and putting the whole trading system under a cloud for several years without much resolution, which doesn't help either the economic side or the environmental side of this equation. So what do we do? I think this is an area where the major trading nations have to take the initiative first. And fortunately, we have a G20 constituted, which is focusing on a wide range of global economic issues, in particular on how to revive the global economy, and trade has to be one part of that. And the first thing to do is follow the old maxim, do no harm. Here I think there is a need for what I've been calling for some time, a peace clause on trade restrictions in support of climate change initiatives. Basically, to put off for a couple of years the advent of border measures or distorting subsidies that would complicate the ability to craft a post-Kyoto, a global climate change regime. This should start with the G20. They're the kings of the greenhouse gas emitters, and they're the ones that are needed for any type of agreement to go forward. And they should commit for 2 years not to do this, so that there is time to craft a viable global regime, climate change regime. 2 years is twice as long as the hortatory standstill agreed in November 2008 by the G20 ministers and leaders meeting in Washington. Hopefully such a peace clause would be honored more than that previous standstill, which was violated within hours after it was signed by countries such as Russia and others. The second point is there needs to be action taken in Geneva for the long-term sustainability of these policies. Now, you can't restructure the Doha agenda. Some people have called for that, saying, well, let's rip it up, let's put in a blue and green agenda and redo the Doha round. I think that's a formula for killing the Doha round and critically wounding the WTO as an institution. But we can think of some type of pre-commitment, building on the precedents of the Uruguay round, where we had a built-in agenda. And that built-in agenda could establish a post-Doha WTO program that includes work on trade and trade-related climate change and how the WTO can deal with environmental problems, can deal with labor issues, how one could move forward with WTO institutional reform so that the trading system can better accommodate the challenges facing countries in the 21st century. We can't afford a lapse waiting to build a new agenda after the Doha round is completed. And I'm one of the world's great optimists by even saying completing the Doha round. And I'm talking about 2010 at the earliest. But if an agreement includes a built-in agenda, I think we can at least get a start at addressing these challenges before they come up and really bite us. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you very much for the optimism as well as for the specific ideas. We've heard a number of ideas here in all these proposals, in all the presentations, and I hope perhaps they've provoked interest. So we've got some time remaining, and I would welcome comments and questions. Who'd like to go first? Please. Can you? Thank you.
Finger. I've worked on these things at the World Bank for a long time. A comment for Brad Fiegel and a question. First of all, I'm old enough to remember, but you probably not. But there was a provision in the Smoot-Hawley tariff that allowed for administrative reduction of tariffs. In fact, was used almost as often to reduce tariffs as to increase them. I'll give you the details on that later. My question, though, is if there are these high rates of tariffs on footwear in the range of 20%, to which there is no opposition, why they haven't been negotiated away in the WTO negotiations. Negotiators love to have opportunities to make concessions where there's no resistance back home.
Yeah. Well, we tried to do this in the Uruguay round, and at that time there was sufficient enough domestic opposition in the United States to prevent it from happening. Interestingly enough, now the U.S. is supportive of 0 for 0 in the Doha round, and we're having problems with some of our trading partners of India and China, which are, by the way, footwear exporting nations. So, and I keep, we go to USTR to talk about this, and can we just do this? And they say, well, this is something we don't want to give this up. This is something that we're going to get in the Doha round, and that's conversation that's been going on for about 4 years. So, at the same time, consumers are eating the cost, companies are getting hit, and so the idea is let's move on. I mean, we can't wait for the Doha round. I mean, I know this is a good pay for the United States to give to China or someone else, although China doesn't really care about it. So I just think it's, the domestic footwear and the footwear industry has changed significantly over the years. And the U.S. used to have one, no longer really exists, with the exception of a couple, fireman boots and things like that we still make here. And we're not interested in that yet. Although the Air Fireman boot sounds pretty good, doesn't it?
Also, I discovered the webpage something in Spanish is called a possible timing for firemen.
Yeah, exactly. So the bottom line is it hasn't really been ripe for duty elimination in previous rounds, but it clearly is now, and clearly the U.S. can move forward. Not on all. Clearly there's some footwear tariffs that have domestic opposition, and we're not interested in those. But those that are, that have no domestic opposition, no controversy, we think we can move forward on.
And Brad, just to go back to the point you made in the presentation as a follow-on, the reason that you explained it's not being done autonomously by the United States, that is through a miscellaneous tariff bill, is the PAYGO feature of the current situation, which would require the Congress to find a revenue source if we were to forego revenue by deciding ourselves to lower those tariffs.
Yeah, that's right. It's for us to do this unilaterally, it'd be about $1 billion that we'd have to make up somewhere else, and we haven't been able to find the thing. I'll even go further in my proposal. You can tell I'm still thinking about this stuff, but if Congress does come up and give us these duty reductions, non-controversial duty reductions, there would be a commitment from those companies that benefited to plow some of that back into labor and environment enforcement on the ground, as well as giving consumers a break on the prices of the product. So, I mean, there's a lot of things you can do to tie this to labor and environment, but and again, it would be a huge benefit for the companies.
Another question? Aloisio.
Can you hear me well?
But we'll do better with the microphone.
Thank you. I guess this question is for the whole panel. I heard several ideas, and I would maybe make a general question as to how to deal with them, especially with regards to WTO. If the WTO is where it is, if the Doha round is where it is right now, with a lot simpler agenda than it would be if we included environment, labor, and other issues in it. How do you think we can deal with that? And in that same let's say situation, if we put that into regional agreements, we hear that there may be renegotiation of Nafta, which is probably the biggest regional agreement in the Americas. How are we going to deal with this if we're having problems with much simpler agendas? It's okay to say, all right, we have these concerns we need to include in the agenda. There's another thing to say, how do you make it operational? I mean, how do you put it in practice? That would be my questions. Welcome your comments.
Let me give the panelists 30 seconds to think, and I'll take the liberty of having the microphone to offer an idea at least. One of the problems that I think we're facing in the Doha round is the relative disengagement by the typical stakeholders in the U.S. and the EU toward the success of the round. Again, I would not ascribe its failure so far solely to that, but it's certainly the case if you look at where industry is and other stakeholders, that there's not a lot driving interest toward successful conclusion of the round, and I think that may be a significant contributor to some of the difficulties. One could certainly argue that although you risk complicating an already complicated round by adding these other issues, that if you added issues that were important to various stakeholders in the U.S. and the EU in particular, that you might actually enhance and increase the chances of success simply because you're adding more of interest. But I don't discount the level of complexity and the fact that there are 151 other players or whatever, minus 26. But it seems to me that there's at least a point to make on that. But I'll let others speak. Jeff, do you want to?
Just building on that. First, I disagree. I don't think the current agenda is simpler. It's less relevant. It's the 20th century. It's addressing 20th century problems. and there are bigger fish to fry because many ambassadors in Geneva don't realize that the current level of openness in the world economy is going to be pulled back through a variety of regulatory means, WTO legal regulatory means, unless there is attention given to these issues, to energy, environment, and labor. Second, there is a need for a buy-in, as was just said, to get interest, not just in the United States, but it also applies in Europe and to many developing countries, into getting political support for the negotiation, to revive the negotiation. And I think in terms of the Obama administration, it would be very helpful to have some clear signal that the WTO is going to begin to engage on the climate change issue. Obviously, it's not going to negotiate climate change agreements, but it has to be able to find a way to accommodate the commercial and the environmental objectives going forward. And the peace clause is the first step, do no harm, to prevent a rollback of liberalization and an advent of new protectionism. Nicole, did you want to?
Yeah, I would just add a little bit to what Jeff said, which is if you don't address this in a global forum, then you're going to be faced with individual countries doing their individual activities. For example, the Lacey Act. And I don't know if you all saw that the EU just has enacted almost a similar, or they will be voting on a similar provision. It's not the species and the genus, but you have to know the origin of the forest and of the wood and disclose this information. So we're already seeing another environmental issue that the U.S. took up and put a regulation in place. The EU is taking up, putting a regulation in place. And so the question becomes, if you address it on a global forum, can you make it more uniform, which makes it easier for other people? So I think one of the bigger issues is while it does throw more into the mix, it also allows people to come away from, it's like a buffet, it allows you to come away with a plate with a greater variety of foods. And you're able to trade off more and put a little more of this back and take a little more of that. So I think it can maybe enhance actually and move it forward. And I totally agree. We've got to start looking at some of the 21st century issues as opposed to looking at the ones from the historically who have plagued us.
John?
I think with respect to the WTO, there's a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem. If the people who are responsible for the WTO agenda right now are not seen to be dealing with 21st century problems and things that matter, then the CEOs won't come to town, and and the level of business interest that's needed to push around over the threshold won't exist. On the other hand, those same people have done nothing so far in their conduct of handling the Doha round to date to suggest that they deserve to have more and new important issues entrusted to them. And I think they're going to have a hard time sorting that out. In the regional setting, there's a certain elementary logic to the idea that we've gone as far as we've gone on an MFN basis while being pretty much agnostic about what everybody's labor and environmental policies are. And it's that next layer of liberalization that is the one where we have to care, how enlightened are those special trading partners with whom we have special arrangements, either pursuant to preference programs or free trade agreements. There we do have to care. And so that's, where there is enough demand to pay attention to those issues and where they can potentially be addressed. I don't see a smidgen of a chance that they can be addressed effectively and successfully on a multilateral basis anytime soon. But, we've proven that they can be in bilaterals.
I think we've reached the scheduled conclusion. I feel comfortable in saying that before the coffee break, I think we had reached the depths of depression in our discussion of trade and finance. And I think we've managed to come back to a place where I feel comfortable sending you off to the lunch hour because not only have we heard some creative solutions, but a sense that at least with the existing rules and perhaps with the existing platforms for negotiation, there are ways to move forward. So with that, I want to thank again our hosts, and please join me in thanking the panelists. And Aloisio, I think you have the last word.
Here anymore. As Paulo said, I'm going to have the last, and he's going to have the very last word in this program. I'd like to thank all the panelists that came here today and accepted my invitation to come. Thank again Paulo Sotero and the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center for receiving us once again. This is our 5th edition, and we'll be here again, always on the Friday before Carnival. I would like to thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed, and thank you again. Paulo.
Well, thank you, Aloysio. So next year, since we are optimists and we think the recession will be over, you can all bring your costumes because we are going to leave on a big carnival parade to celebrate the good news from here. Thank you very much for coming. The discussion today, I think, was very interesting, expanded. I think it brought new elements. We hope to produce very soon a report on the conference and to publish it online. So please keep looking at our calendar of events at the website. The video of this event will be available in about 1 week. So if you want to see again parts of it or the entirety in it, you can go to our site. It will be there. There is the new site. Please go Wilson Center on Demand. It's very interactive, very nice. And I hope to see you often here in our programs. Thank you again for all the participants. Thank you, Aloysio. Thank you for the Brazilian Embassy. And we meet here Friday of Carnival next year after the recession, and come often to the Wilson Center. Thank you.